For those seeing this on tape, I had asked again tonight, or had a sign put up that I would entertain apparently or fake psychological / behavioral problems. And I must say, this is not an attack, because I could look at it otherwise, but there was less than an avalanche of questions. And those of you that sees it later in other places on tape, I do this periodically on the basis of giving everyone leeway to write a question that would seem to be, if I were Big Daddy Freud, Big Daddy Pope, Big Daddy Rabbi, of asking some question of, dear sir, or madam as the case may be. Thought I'd check. And then asking it on the basis that ordinary people would. My love life is falling apart, my brain is falling apart, I can't deal with aluminum siding salesmen anymore, whatever. Because of the fact that I have intended, of course, to have at least the superficial, that is, at least the verbal effect on people of not dealing with apparent personal problems, that you cannot continue to expend your energy to let it drain out on the basis that I am having very serious, very real personal problems. You cannot do this, do that, and do this. So when I say it's not an attack, I could look at it otherwise, but I almost got no questions. There was one here I'll read a piece of that is rather pertinent to what I was just saying. It's, dear doctor, my problem seems to be that my problems just don't seem to have much oomph anymore. I know I surely still do terrible things, and that terrible things still happen to me and all around me, but I just don't seem to get real worked up about it. Can you tell me, do I have tired blood, or is some other terrible thing starting to happen to my blood? 2 questions. The answer is no and quasi yes. And I had another one, I'm not sure I even marked it, but someone, again, was commenting and almost wanting to point out problems that they began to feel a return of a lack of energy. They felt as though they were back in the employ of the great Mr. D. And rather than respond again to that on a personal level, let me just throw out to you again with no great comment. A time comes eventually that the group, this group and every other group, all this activity before us throughout horizontal and vertical history, comes a time eventually that the group requires not I activities. And that eventual need has become presently. It's been presently. And that is a part of what I tell you about us having to do something publicly. It is not just this. It's all connected, but part of it is a kind of incestuous drain of energy. And I have, if you might note now, I have periodically dealt with this by having you become involved every year or so with these kind of Evo texts, turning it over to you to come up with something publicly, in which I had almost no involvement, and just left it with you for a set period of time, and then it was over. And according to how much you participated and according to how much you understood how you were participating, everyone receives apparently some boost of energy from that, if not a boost in what they understand. But the time comes that there has to be a continuing not I activity. Those of you that, well, all of you should have some interest, because it is not gossip. But let me point out, when it gets down to lower levels of this kind of activity, the run-of-the-mill gurus, cults going on, life still understands what it's doing. And what I have just noted is still true in those groups, but there has always historically and presently been a rather efficient way that life deals with this, is that the group, once this life is dealing with some guru somewhere, and there is some crowd collects, once it seems to get stabilized, he's got enough people that they can buy property, buy a church, buy some land, is then the not I activity primarily becomes keeping up the guru. It's historically proven, life has learned what it's doing, as if nothing else. They get together and they buy 1,000 acres, they buy a $500,000 building somewhere, and then the not I activity of the group, whether they're ever having a real I activity or not, the not I activity becomes, listen, I can't do it. I'm too busy communing with the gods and whatever those gurus do. You people have got to look after it. And so you have got the not I activity already built into it. I would assume that you do understand that that has no profit, or else we'd be doing that. That is not the way it operates. But it is not so simple as for me to give you an absolute alternative in words. But it cannot be on the basis that the not I activity is simply busy work. But that is all the way from not only cults, but all the religions. Looked at from what you understand now, you should have a glimpse of the fact that they are all involved with make-do work. Going through rituals, going to Mass, doing what other religions do. It is busy work. But there has to be that. There especially has to be that if there was no real I activity involved. If it was not to the level that the people are actually evolving themselves in this lifetime. Anything less than that, it's always some form. To some degree, it is make-do work. But even with us, what I'm pointing out, there reaches times, it goes in cycles. I point them out to you. We're back in one. I can have some effect on it. I can push things a little bit, but it becomes less than profitable for me to do it. Just for me to singly try to push everybody, it's like everybody's car breaks down at one time, and I have to push everybody just over the next hill. Thus far, I've always been able to do it, and I don't see that I would ever lose the ability to do it. I might point out to you that I might lose some of the enthusiasm of doing it. But beyond what people do with themselves, of doing some real activity, of evolving their own circuitry, there does absolutely come the time. And I know that hardly any of you have any real understanding of this, and it's not even that important. But there comes a time that you have to start directing your attention, based upon my old equation, on what seems to be not I. That is, of doing something out there. I'll use a few more of these questions, but also over the last 3 or 4 months, I have kept some of the questions that came up of people asking me about subjects that I had mentioned over the last year or so. And based upon some of the things I've been saying over the last several weeks, I'm going to hop, skip, and jump over a few of them. One of them had to do with the triaxial perception unit. A year, 2 years, whoever keeps up with time, somebody asked me about it again. And those of you who don't remember my new term, what I was pointing out at that time was, in another way, the necessity of producing, I could call it a new way to look at things, but except it is not some theoretical proclamation, it is not some theoretical idea that this is the way things should be. It can only come about through an absolute biochemical alteration. It seems to reside here, but as I pointed out to you, it affects everything. You've got to affect it, such as being relatively sane from the bottom up. But then what happens will also affect you. It is not a matter, I repeat to you again, I keep trying to give you a hint with this without making outlandish promises verbally. But if you ever see someone that makes any claim to having some superior understanding and they're suffering for it, forget it. Well, we're all going to die. I'm going to die one way or the other. But people who are suffering over what they understand, that the gods have opened my eyes to such a degree, and I see what's going on, and my heart is broken. I can't stand it. It almost makes me inoperable. I want to stay in bed and cry over the suffering of the world. Well, if you find any intrigue in that, It just shows that you understand nothing. You're still fooling with the employees. But what I was mentioning, it's been over a year, I'm sure, since I used that term. But what I was pointing out at that time was a little less specific. Instead of me just dwelling upon it in a rather straightforward biochemical way, I was giving you an alternative of a less specific description of a triaxial perception unit, wherein someone could approach whatever was going on with what amounts to 3 different views of it. In a minute I'll tie that with something else somebody asked me about the double I alliance. But also along about that time I mentioned, if you recall, how, me speaking very often about the machinery of things, the way things are wired up, and I point out to you that life itself, the way things are put together, it's almost as though everyone, all possibilities, reside not in some absolutely locked up piece of machinery that is ground down to 0.00000 tolerances, but is like a socket, that there is a kind of looseness within certain confines, wherein the kind of examples I've made up for you, that someone is going out and you cannot absolutely predict that that person will be at one place 7.5 minutes from now. But based upon, if you isolated reality and you looked upon that person and you understood what they were and the way the environment was that time, the way that their equation of I plus not I seemed to be, just that isolated slice, you could absolutely predict they're going there. And you could absolutely predict almost an unnumberable other possibilities of things they will not do. Not now, and maybe not ever, but they're not going to do it in the next 7 minutes. Within the next 7 minutes, this kind of socket arrangement, there is a little looseness. They may be at the place I'm telling you. When the guy said, if you recall one example I made up, the man says, I'm going to go down to the store and get another 6-pack. And if you could slice up reality and isolate that, and you were floating above it, and you could suddenly see, not figure out, not think about, that you could actually see how this person was wired up into the machinery of everything else. At once, you know, he's had enough drinks, you see everything that's going on, you see what he is, and he says, hey baby, I'm going down to the 7-Eleven, I'm going to get another 6-pack. You would know. He's going down to 7-Eleven to get a 6-pack very shortly. He's out of beer, and he's ready for another one. And he's going to get there, or he's going to die. The only thing that's going to stop him from getting down there, well, all right, he might be arrested. He might get cut. But something terrible is going to happen to keep him from doing it. But on the way, going downstairs in the parking lot, he might talk to somebody. He might talk to several people. But he is going there. And when he says he's going there to get a 6-pack, that's where he's going. He's not going there, and he's not going in and ask them, what was a good year for a Chardonnay, or he's not going to ask for champagne. But there is a kind of looseness that is necessary. But you understand, when I'm talking about a socket, it can't come out. It can turn a little bit. But that is in that. To expand that a bit, what I meant by having a triaxial perception unit is you fill up that looseness. Because that kind of looseness in that socket arrangement at the ordinary level precludes any understanding. I was afraid of that. Yeah. At the ordinary level, having this amount of looseness is very limited. It can't come out, but it has a certain amount of give to it. That within itself, this is one explanation I'm giving you, one map, that alone would preclude anyone ever understanding anything, because everything is subject to move just a little bit. That's why I was hoping for 90 seconds previously. Your understanding is not going to change the course of looseness. Your understanding is not going to change the nature of the way that life is wired up right now at the human level. But by you understanding something, by being able to start approaching it, which I started to even give you a whole new term, instead of neuralize, would be approach. Would be like the first stage of being able to neuralize something. It'd be almost like a, let me say that for a second. Unless you could look at something, not one piece at a time, and not theoretically, unless you can approach it and you have got the ability to see it from 3 different angles, then you're always going to have this necessary socket arrangement, and nothing is ever stable enough, and because of the looseness there, nothing can ever be understood. No matter what your IQ is, no matter how developed your yellow circuit was naturally, no matter how much education you have. I assume that all of you have had to face that sad fact. All the philosophers, all the thinkers always come down and say, listen, I'm not sure. In some quarters, at certain times, in fact, that seems to be the final blow of your own self-promotion. As I used to think I knew a lot, I'm going to tell you what, I don't know it all. In the book. As long as you've got this looseness, everything is subject to continually shift, ever so slightly, in that which a man can think of the yellow circuit he has pinpointed. I now understand this phenomenon. You should know it now, he doesn't. Because no matter what the yellow circuit can point out at any level, I, or life, will bring up somebody just automatically, if it amounts to anything to begin with, that somebody will immediately rise up, another voice will say, contraire. Based upon the data you have just given us, I reach absolutely the opposite conclusion, and listen to me. And of course, if you're any good, you can listen to his, you can listen to the first one. Both of them are right. Ordinary perception, ordinary consciousness cannot do that. But what I am trying to describe to you again, this triaxial perception unit, I like that. TPU. It's whatever is under question you can see in 3 different ways. And when you can do that, you fill up that looseness. Just as an aside, let me point out, I can take this, me describing this socket, and I could reverse that and give you the same story. Anybody wants to really watch it. But it is as though you have filled up the looseness, and you can see how things are put together right there in that situation. Like I said, I could reverse this verbally, but it's almost as though you have produced a kind of freewheeling tightness in you. But the tightness is not a kind of absolute opinionated intellectualism that passes for being real intelligence, because all it takes is an ordinary person to say, all right, I can see the validity of this, and I can see the folly of this. I can see it clearly. Not only can I see the validity of the first part, I can tell you exactly why the contrary could not be true. All right, that could pass for being stable, rigid. But notice I said it's a kind of freewheeling that you have to be able to immediately see and understand both possible arguments, pro and con, yes and no, I like, I dislike. That's just child's play. But a kind of triaxial perception is you can see it from 3 different ways, and it's as though you can take up all the looseness in the socket arrangement right then, whatever is under discussion or whatever the subject is of your own investigation, and you can see how it's connected with everything. But it's not connected in 2 ways. Several times I just stopped and I said I would tie it into something else before I said what I started to say, and that was someone else several months ago asked me about my reference one night been over a year ago, again, I believe, I referred to a double I, letter I, alliance. The great DIA, to go along with the TPU. And the CCC. The double I alliance, if you remember I mentioned, had to do with two different I's. One I being IT, and the other one being the letter I, referring to good old you and me. And then the way that people indiscriminately, according to just how they're wired up and what the circumstance is, for instance, someone can say, "It made me mad," or someone just simply says, "I am mad." And I'm not going to drag it out again. The first time, I think I used an example about a casserole, if you remember. That the casserole has no taste, it has no taste, or I can't taste it. So I'm trying to up the stakes a little bit. It made me mad, I am mad. Or it requires, under all ordinary conditions, it requires both of those eyes to produce anything that is an observable experience. Anything that is an experience. A person will not feel as though something has occurred unless you have both eyes in operation. The way things ordinarily operate is a person would either say, think, or feel, with the supporting words, only one of those. That I am mad in reference to some situation or to some person. Or they would say it, and they could be talking about a person and what the person did, the situation. It made me mad. With no analyzation, to them it would appear to be if somebody stopped them and said, "Wait, are you saying you're mad?" I mean, that's the prime statement you're making, is you're mad. That's what you're feeling. That seems to be right now the center of your existence, is you're mad. Or are you saying that this thing outside, this person, this situation that occurred, it made you mad? You know, which is happening, or which is the most important? Do you see what I'm asking? You might get somebody to say, you know, if they weren't mad, too mad to answer, they might say, "Oh, well, all right." So a person with no understanding of what was going on, they might say, "All right, okay, yeah, I'm mad. I can't blame it all on what happened. I'm just mad. I tell you what, I'm mad, and I'm not sure. It might be partly my fault, but I'm mad." And another person might say, "Wait, I was blameless. I think I know what you're asking. It made me mad. What that person did to me, it made me mad. As far as possible in this one situation, my hands are clean. If not my feet, they're clean. It made me mad." But it takes both, and ordinary consciousness never sees that. Neither statement alone is correct. Now we jump from ordinary mechanics of life itself, but neither statement, under any conditions, from anyone trying to pursue this, neither statement alone is correct. When I say it's not correct, by now I should be able to push a little further. It doesn't actually exist. It's one piece of reality. It is what people unknowingly refer to as imagination, delusion. It's real enough, but it doesn't tell you anything. Neither of those statements alone is pertinent. To say, "I am mad. I am mad. I don't care who knows it. I can't help it. I am mad." That's nothing. But on the other hand, to say, "It made me mad. What happened made me mad. Let me tell you the circumstance. I bet you would be mad. It made me mad." Either one of those alone are just absolutely irrelevant to ever understanding anything. Now, if you put them both together, if you could hold both of those together and be aware of the fact, no matter what your hardwired self, line level, wanted to say, what it was already projecting to you internally, "I am mad," or "it made me mad." All right, if you can put them both together, you're approaching a point that you can almost create a cancellation of those kind of mechanical charges, like of a positive and a negative. That, you know, I'm either mad regardless of what happened, or something I hear made me mad, and by and large, I'm not even to blame. It's just a natural consequence. If a person could hold both of those, you would be approaching the steps that lead somewhere close to neuralizing. If you can do all three, if you can hold both of those statements, and then a third one, which you're back to a trilateral perception, you are within the reach, you're within the possible reach of the reality of my great made-up word, neuralizing. But it is beyond I am mad, regardless of what happened. It is beyond something made me mad, and any human would respond accordingly, similarly. Either one of those you know is irrelevant. It's meaningless, or the whole world would be where the whole world wishes it was. But if you could take them both, you still don't have much. You got at best an approach. You got at best the possibility of being able to cancel out two opposites, two opposing charges. The binary mind can't do that. To talk about a third possibility to ordinary people, of course, is ridiculous. Well, for one thing, the first thing they want to know is, all right, what is the third one? That's how ridiculous they are. Also, whether I read them or not, I'm going to twist something else somebody asked me, and several people brought it up tonight, or similar. It's in the same ballpark if you'll listen, those of you who wrote the questions. Let me ask you a question. I've asked you 4 or 5 times, and I've told you 400 or 500 times. Can ordinary consciousness actually think of something unless it says it? You don't need a book. You didn't really need me to tell you. Remember, now you're supposed to be one of the handful of people in the world that understand that there is one place to study. There is one laboratory. Of course, it does have certain drawbacks, any of you who don't know it. Don't ever go in business and live over the store. Trust me, many people think that would be a boon, that they'd cut down on expenses. I'll rent this little store, and it's got a back room. Hell, I don't need much. I'll sleep there, and then I get up in the morning. I don't have to drive. I can just get 5 minutes before I open the store. Believe me, unless you're absolutely horizontally insane, you'll hate it. So, did anybody think that I changed the subject? It would be a lot nicer, would it not, as you always dream, that knowing what you know about you, knowing that in some way the guides have touched you at a very young age, you were wise beyond your years, or at least sarcastic beyond your years when you were young, and if you could have just saved the money to have gone to Tibet instead of Atlanta, if you had just had the money to track down Guru so-and-so before he died only 8 years ago, he could have given you the answer. And then you end up with me, and I'm telling you, you're going as far as is reasonable as to show up here. Those of you who just live down the street, to pull yourself together, to hopefully take a shower before you get here, to come down here. Because I've already asked you enough questions, which was, of course, telling you something, and I've told you enough outright. And so, such questions as, can consciousness really, just ordinary consciousness, as best you have ever experienced it within yourself, and as now you should be able to observe it from a slightly different position, can it actually think, quotation marks, think of anything without saying it? It's a very weighty question, one that I'm sure people have to go away and think about, or maybe go to the library and check out some books. You know, maybe ask me after, is there books you would recommend that would maybe encourage me to help me along? That's why I'm no longer pushing cars over hills. It's semis. There's nowhere to look. There's nothing to do if you belong in this. It's an astounding thing to discover. Whatever be the answer, which I've already told you, I like the way I do this. Go back and ask you all over like I never did, and most of you... No, it's no attack on you. That's the way it's supposed to go. But I'm just pointing out to you again, since everybody enjoys a good laugh. Ha-ha. So here I am asking you again. Many of you make notes like I'll look into this. Can you think of anything without this thing saying it? I got another one. This was not a question, but I assume everyone's always heard this, or that you've heard it, not always. I hope you haven't always. As they say that no man is a hero to his valet or to his butler. And you could hear that if you were just a reasonably sophisticated person. You could hear that and think, I bet that's true. And I've even heard ordinary people go this far in literature or magazine articles or somewhere. This is not that unusual that I've heard of ordinary people say, maybe a man or woman enrolls in a graduate course that moves halfway across the country just to be near a certain professor, an author in the field. They have read his stuff, they've discussed it, they had little groups, and he gets there close to him. You know, I'm talking about ordinary people. This is not unique. That they will come to a conclusion that once they got that close, went to all the trouble, and they've now got classes with him. He's been one of their heroes for years. Maybe even the professor says, every Saturday I have tea over at my house for the graduate students, and if you'd like to come by. And somebody decides, his work, his ideas have meant so much to me, I don't really want to get that close to him. I'm no dummy, because I've heard of shit like that. Maybe graduate students don't talk like that. I've heard of such occurrences as that. Therefore, I won't get too close to him because I've always read, maybe not always, but I've read that no man is a hero to his valet. Therefore, as much as he's meant to me, I don't want to get that close to him because what if I find out that he's a terrible person? That passes for some kind of superior, at least out of the ordinary intelligence. All right, there is, I assume by your laughter, there is a widespread, at least binary knowledge that there is validity to this. That whoever at line level might have been your heroes. Abraham, Einstein, Winston Churchill. Imagine his valet. Whoever had to put up with him all the time. When he was sick, when he didn't feel good, when he had too much to drink. Or just to find out, just in general, in his free time, he's obnoxious. And, you know, it's just his hobby. And this guy is around him all the time, and then he helps him get dressed and has to change his dirty underwear for him and tell him to put on clean socks. And he pushes him out on the balcony, he walks out, and hundreds of thousands of people cheer. And his valet stand back there behind the, you know. All right, what I'm getting to is this. If there is validity to that, which you should see there is, from several ways, how could one use that, since everything life has ever said can be used? All of you who don't know that, you better write it down. There is nothing that you can't learn from. What could you possibly, how could you possibly use that all in here? Two things. How is it that this statement, let's just assume, for me to push you as far as I can without making dogmatic statements, and I don't have my shots, that no man is a hero to his valet, that is the closest person to him. Not blood kin, paid, but he's still close. He's the guy that puts him in bed, wakes him up, cleans up around the bed when he throws up from having drunk too much, has to get women out that he picks up in the street before his wife gets home, but not blood kin, not because he loves the guy necessarily. Employee. How could you possibly use that, assuming that is just an overall valid statement that life is put into words through man's mouth, having to do with the way things are wired up, that no man is a hero to his valet. What could you possibly make of that all in here? And secondly, what could you make of that other scenario that I brought up to you of someone saying, wait a minute, there are people that I have some respect for, and I don't think about a man not being a hero to his valet. I don't even want to get close enough. I don't want to get anywhere near as close as his valet might get, because it might ruin my picture, my feeling of him. How could you possibly use that? Not out there with some professor in graduate school and a Friday afternoon tea, but all in here having only to do with you know who. Only having to do with you and all the little yous. What could you possibly learn from that? How could that possibly make any sense internally? Of course, that is not a question, because it can make all kinds of sense. I'm going to leave it with you. I read another one. Not a question from you people, but this kind of thing that shows up, I'm sure it's surely in some kind of book of famous quotations. I don't know when it was from, but it had to do, it was like this. It had to do with, the statement started out, like a lot of talk is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, I'm not quoting this exactly, but this is the gist of it. And I read it, it was, well, let me tell you. A quantity of talk is not necessarily in itself a bad thing, because talk itself can be like spading the earth, spading and turning up the earth for a crop of thoughts to come. And in so doing, you can't really guarantee what you might turn up. All right, I read that somewhere. Some ordinary human said that, more or less. That's the gist of it. Some other humans were impressed enough, somebody remembered it, somebody wrote it down, it got into a magazine or a book somewhere. And it's also the sort of thing you should be able to hear. You know, the laughter one, now, it's not laughing at what the person said. You should be able to feel at line level that an ordinary person, you, at the ordinary level, could read that and go, hey, I'm going to remember that. That talk is similar to, even undirected talk, unfocused talk, but talk is similar to spading up the soil for a coming crop of thoughts. And in so doing this kind of random spading, you can't really guarantee what might turn up. That, you know, just by excessive talk, it's kind of a variation of the, 100 monkeys, 100 typewriters. But at line level, you should surely hear what I'm saying, that you could read that or hear it and think, hey, there's something to that. I'd like to remember that. That all kinds of people want to sit around, their friends, and have bull sessions, sit around and discuss the latest novels or discuss philosophical ideas from past thinkers, sit around and drink coffee all night. It's very common. I'm sure many of you went through that. It's an old historic hobby. Much fun at a certain age. And just keep talking. And it's like suddenly, at off times, maybe especially if you had a few LA turnarounds, some bennies, a little pot, enough coffee in the system, that suddenly you or somebody else goes rah, 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 and says something, and everybody goes, wow, let me write it down. And it's just like, if you talk enough, you can't tell what might turn up. Well, I guess it is fairly well understood that contrary to that literally, I am, to say the very least, strongly in favor of, and have done everything from encourage to threaten you people, is just about talk as little as possible until you know otherwise. But even though I've told you that correctly, that you got no business running off your mouth all the time. You got no business saying half the things you say to start with. And some of you have been here for a while, and now it's probably up to the 3/4 of the things. But for me to take that kind of quote, if you could take that idea that was put in to the gist of verbal, overt talk. That talking being like playing up ground for possible crops of coming thoughts in the process. Within the process, you never can tell what might turn up along the way. If you could take all of that and turn it into an internal, willful process, you would almost have something. You would almost have the steps going up to the room where neuralizing hides. You might also be close to where would be the ground to produce a triaxial perception unit. But notice I said a willful attempt and an internal attempt. Not random, not mechanical, not unfocused talk, but what if you could take that, and I'm not going to change the words much because I want you to try to see something on your own. If you could take that idea and turn it all internally, you did it willfully, you'd almost have something. You'd almost have the possibility for a real something. I said, we'll have to hint more. What if you could, at the ordinary level, the line level in the yellow circuit, what if you could think like that? Not talk. Nobody sees any connection between that and a TPU, a triaxial perception unit. Nobody can see any connection between that and that kind of double I alliance, a kind of freewheeling tightness. Or worse yet, since we've been on the subject in the last week or so, does that strike any of you better read persons, at least from a few decades back, that some of this sounds like descriptions of insanity? That is not a stable, right-thinking, normal person. That is not their internal workings. Of course, anybody says that, don't ask them, how do you know that? Because then they'll quote you chapter and verse. And of course, none of you would be dirty enough to say, have you ever taken a look at your own processes? Why should I have to put up with such a low-level field of investigation when for $5.95 you can buy Freud and Jung and everybody else in paperback? I don't have to put up with this. I got money. I know my way around the library. I can go read about it. I especially don't need to stand here and discuss it with a dunderhead like you with such weird ideas. A note somebody made, and several people have, the last few months, pointed out little things specifically and otherwise. And I guess everybody should be aware of it. I'm becoming gradually aware of it. I knew it, but now I know it for a fact. In a recent tape, you mentioned about life resisting genetic explanations for bad behavior, behavioral problems, etc., noting that the environmental determinism argument helps people feel as though they can fix things. If all of you recall, that's what I was saying last week, via the environment. I pointed out that was another aspect of the master stroke. The person goes on to say, it interests me that they were reading about advances in molecular biology, that they're beginning to focus on the theories and attempts now of fixing things, that is, human so-called problems, behavior problems, via the genetic route. All right, some of you may have already known this. Some of you may have known this as an external fact even before I heard about it. I just know how things go. I see it on a bigger range. But what the person, if I didn't chop that up too bad, me saying last week that has always been that they will not accept, that there is just a great hue and cry throughout history anytime somebody comes out. Anytime that life, in its own great infinite wisdom, decides in some way that over here it raises up a person, a school of thought that points out that, hey, what's going on here is just by and large, as far as we can tell, and we got data to prove it, to support it, that what's going on here has almost nothing to do with environmental influences that these people are operating and being caused to operate from some other area. And of course, the binary mind only has one other area left. But you're talking about people are criminal, people are drinkers, people are ill-tempered because of genetics. And life has always brought up a very vehement cry from another part of its body, looking at that as being almost, if not religious and humanitarian, even scientific heresy. And it's almost irrational, so I was trying to get you to consider and to ponder why. It is changing, and it is true. There's been the field that some of you may have read more than me. I'm just aware of what it is. It made a splash. I guess it's still hanging around. Sociobiology, 7 or 8 years ago. I'm aware of the fact, someone's even came to my attention, they're a psychiatrist. It doesn't seem very unusual now, even using terminology. Somebody told me, they just vaguely was aware of some of my writings. Somebody told me in the last few months that they knew a psychiatrist doing some writings now and was somebody who's primarily dealing with chemical treatment of people who walk in, not lay them down and ask them about their mother and their ruined dress at their birthday party when they were 5. They're treating them chemically and using terms having to do with circuits, referring to somebody's depression circuit, their anxiety circuit. That, hey, no problem. That's, some people are born that way. Here's a pill. Here's a prescription. I am aware of that, and times are changing. It is getting there. That's what I've been talking to you about in general, of how the level is moving, but it is still a great part of life's staggering process of movement, that there is still you can learn something about you, the way you're wired up, that there is still a large part of life's body that cries out with passion, to say the least, that any question or any idea that human problems, behavior problems, could be anything other than environmental is just heresy. That it's still going on. But times are changing. If you people live long enough, sometimes things even change faster than I keep up with. I don't go around checking every little thing. I know how things are operating. But I was somewhat amused, pleased, at least it shows life's health, that now there's psychiatrists. Not that I own the word circuitry. I'm not even insinuating by any means that they got it from me. I'm not saying that. But now somewhere there's psychiatrists around that they're evidently, well, I was aware of that, but they're evidently very common now, that their almost exclusive mode of treatment is biochemical. Fuck all that talking, all that shit. If you're anxious, your anxious circuit. You were born that way, it gets too excited. And hell, we got enough pharmaceutical houses now. They've been working on that now for several years. Here, I got 2 prescriptions. One of these will work. I can guarantee you. One of them will just calm it right down. Next. That's it. Now, in a sense, that's my kind of psychiatrist. And I don't mean to make that from some personal viewpoint. What I'm insinuating is there is the psychiatrist of tomorrow. There's the kind of thing that Kyroot was asking last week, whether you heard it, is where did the mind get off, giving its ailments such fancy names? Is it insinuating in some way that they were more exotic than distended livers? That has been also a piece of the master stroke, that this thing is in some way separate. Its ailments are not even comparable to an overweight spleen or an inverted intestine, nothing. Up here, this is something exotic. And part of the master stroke has always been up until now, and it's not going away automatically tomorrow, but it is changing. Because of the circuitry, there's something growing above the yellow circuit. But it's still on the basis of the master stroke working, that whatever's going on, we as humans can and must fix. But if, in some way, me or someone, some idiot could come out and say, listen, everything is genetic, there's no such thing as environmental influences. It started somewhere. The first thing was genetic compared to environment. So all environment is simply an outgrowth of the original genetic. And the whole world go, wow, if that could happen on that basis that the binary mind operates now, do you understand that everybody would simply give up? That'd be the end of everything, if it were true, or if everybody believed it was true. that I am what I am, and the environmental things, I know it seemed like something happened, but the way my parents treated me was because of their genes. And the way there was depression on that made my father get upset, and now he tells me on his deathbed that the only reason he always mistreated me and always screamed he wished I had been a boy instead of a girl was because he grew up during the Depression, and a woman couldn't get work. That was before the time, so he blamed it on the environment as a whole, the Great Depression, and the Republicans. But the Republicans, how do you get to be a Republican? You don't join anything. It's in your genes. Where did depression come from? Wasn't an environment. There is no environment. But if suddenly everyone could believe, if everyone was made to believe there's no such thing as environmental causes, it's all genetic. Everybody would sit down. That'd be it. I mean, a lot of people would have 2 or 3 seconds of going, boy, that takes a lot off my mind. But 5 minutes later, you'd find cobwebs beginning to grow on them. Well, it is, as I said, many of you may already know this way you look at it that way, but someone also brought to my attention they were reading some literature from AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And they said the literature now just states that drinking in general, I don't have it to quote, they didn't give me a quote, but I was aware of that vaguely. I hear it on TV and see little articles, but it seems to be their general statement now is that alcoholism is a genetic problem. I mean, I'm sure that they still throw in it seems to be brought about or kicked in or made worse by the environmental problems, pressures, and being unemployed or having the wrong sexual partner. But in some way, people are genetically prone to be alcoholics, and it's true. It's true as opposed to, well, hey, a person's a drunk because they're no good, or people are crazy because their parents drove them crazy, or this person is a criminal because they had to quit school at the 8th grade. Given the choices, as the binary mind does, that it's either the environment caused this or it's the genetic makeup of the person, given those two, the former is just, it just doesn't exist. It is the latter. Everything based upon that is genetic. And in a sense, right now, life in general is beginning to move, why I brought up those examples, is beginning to move to take these two opposites and it's going to start bringing them together. But by the time it does, it's not going to create some form of enlightenment. As that begins to happen, this other circuit's beginning to grow. But the day of that argument, the person was right in pointing this out. And I just thought I'd go ahead and throw it in to you people that I am aware of it, because I was aware of what was going on over the large scene. But there are people now that life is causing to speak in that specific way. Doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists. It is not part of the norm in the perception of everybody. And it's a long way from that, and when it gets that close, understand. It gets close enough to actually merge, and those two, like being contradictory charges, that they begin to merge. By the time that happens, it's going to be a new circuit. You're back to the old problem. And by the time it gets to the point that everybody can understand that, it's going to be irrelevant. It'll just be, by then, when it reaches that point, it will be as irrelevant, in a sense, as just being obvious of it, saying everyone has feet. It'll just be an accepted fact.